Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. It has been 9 weeks since the CDC relaxed the mask mandate on vaccinated Americans as a result of the COVID pandemic. In the news today, Democrats proposed a $3.5 billion budget to advance with an infrastructure package, while the European Commission has announced plans to phase out fossil fuels. Today's topic is filling the world with moments of care. We're joined by Michelle Nunn, the president and CEO of CARE. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Ken. It's nice to be.
It's great to see you. And look, I mean, it's been, we used to start these conversations with, it's been this many weeks since social distancing began. And then it was like, we need a new kind of metric to track it. But it's been about 16 months since, the beginning of the pandemic began as well. What has that been like for your team and you personally? How have you guys all handled it?
Yeah, well, so just to step back for a minute. So think about, CARE is a global.
Oh, did we freeze you? All right, we're just checking in, folks. 1 second. Oh, all right, everyone. Hang on 1 second. Michelle will jump right back in. It's always fun on Zoom. Every once in a while, we have technical difficulties, and I think that's motivating us to start doing these in person eventually. So we're in talks to do that. Whether it be in DC or other markets. So keep an eye out. Coffee with Ken might be coming to a neighborhood near you soon. So in the meantime, we're just waiting for Michelle to pop back in, and we'll continue the conversation about CARE, which is 75 years old, and all the good work they're doing globally, as well as renewed focus domestically with a lot of their initiatives. So give us 1 second while we get Michelle back. Oh. Bear with us, folks. Michelle, we lost her. We see you, Michelle. We just mute.
So sorry. Can you hear me, see me now?
We're good. I was just making some commentary. This is going to motivate us to do more in-person things in the future. And I was saying we're going to come to a coffee shop near you.
I would love that. I would love that. I'm sure I had to do some filler. So thank you for that. And I apologize. And I hope that doesn't happen again. I don't know what happened.
All good.
I was just saying that I don't know where I lost you, but as a global humanitarian organization operating in 100 countries, it's had an enormous impact upon us, as you can imagine. Yeah. And it's also, we've seen that COVID has had this enormous impact also on actually the most vulnerable already. So that means that they lose their livelihoods. That means that they're actually going back into the regression around food and access. And so there's a whole set of I would say domino impacts to COVID. And but I'm very proud of the team. We've reached over 35 million people in the last year, done it in entirely new ways, but really have felt that our mission has never been more important.
And tell us, I think last week was the first time you had folks in person back at the office for a little event, a little get together. How was that? How did it feel? I mean, I imagine you must have even onboarded people during this time. I mean, what a challenging year it must be to run an organization whose mission becomes even more amplified during a time like this.
Yeah, I think we have seen that we certainly can do things in ways that we never anticipated, but there's also nothing like community and connection. And so,
Yes.
yes, our team in Atlanta, which is our global headquarters, was able to get together for the first time, have lunch, and it was, I think we you don't realize how much you miss it until you actually have it again, and
Yeah.
so it was a real treat. I think we were profoundly aware, though, the same time that we were able to sort of take off our masks because we had
Yes.
access to vaccines, that so many of our colleagues around the world, in places ranging from Myanmar to India to places in Ghana and or Sierra Leone, for instance, where we work, they're seeing rising cases of COVID, and so just really mindful of the fact that we are feeling like we are turning a corner in the US, but our safety and security, along with everyone else's, is very interdependent.
Yeah, 100%. And let's just unpack kind of a little bit of the legacy and history of care, right? You're 75 years old, right? And I think there's always been kind of a perception that you've been focused externally from the original care packages and so on, right? Talk a little bit about how the mission may have evolved even under your leadership, and how COVID maybe has accelerated in one direction or another your focus and your work on a day-to-day basis with your team.
Yeah. So, 75 years of history with care. And for those of you who don't know, when you send a care package to your kid who's at camp, it actually comes from a couple of Americans who had the idea that we would not look and stand on the sidelines as people faced starvation in post-World War II Europe. And they literally sent care packages, 20,000 from Philadelphia to Le Havre, France, and over time, over 100 million care packages. Now, so that's when you think about logistics and the challenges of what we have in terms of none of the modern technology that we had was available then. So it was a really, I think, extraordinary act of audacity and solidarity. But you fast forward, and we've done all of our work outside of the United States. And so as COVID hit here and we saw the enormity of the way that it was affecting people in terms of hunger and poverty, we said we need to bring back some of the lessons that we've learned around the world and bring them here to the US. And so we started what we call Care Package Relief Corps. We did partnerships with Uber and TaskRabbit, some digital platforms, and we said there are people who are unemployed and underemployed, and also people who need food and who can't leave their homes. And so we paired those needs together, and we have a force of people that are delivering meals and bringing them to people who need them. And also they're getting a salary for that. They're getting paid for that. And so we've delivered close to 5 million care packages, food packages, in the US, and are now looking to how can we really increase our footprint in the US, because we know actually poverty has reduced in half over the last 20 plus years around the globe, but it stayed very stubbornly sort of stagnant here in the US. So there are lessons that we can apply, things that we can do, and I think we do want to ensure that we continue to accelerate our overall global response. We also sort of say that if you think about those 75 years, we've never had the kind of humanitarian situation, a global pandemic, and where we're falling back on some of these important metrics of hunger and poverty for the first time in 5 to 10 to 15 years. So there's a lot of work before us, and it feels like a really important time for care.
And this is really the first time domestically you've been so active, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, has there ever been a period of time when care has really kind of like focused so much internally? And I mean, how much of that was?
Yeah, this is the first time that we've operated in the US. And I think it was just the recognition that, one, that there were enormous needs, and two, that we had the capacity to deliver some of the solutions that we've put forward in the world and to bring that back home.
So when you take a step back and then just look at what you've done over 75 years, I think there's a real kind of narrative around logistics, right? Like you created packages and you got it to those who need it. And you're talking about TaskRabbit and Uber. And we had Billy Shore from No Kid Hungry on over the summer, right? And I know you guys are very close in the work that you do. And, in our conversation with him, really, it's just highlighted the fact that so much of this is really a logistics challenge, right? Like this country makes more food than any other country, right? We have the food, we just can't get, we're not getting it to the right people. We can't. How much of what you do is related to logistics, and how are you trying to kind of take best practices and technology in the private sector and think about, addressing these broader challenges?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. And Billy is doing such remarkable work and has for such a long time. And yes, absolutely. I mean, we do have the capacity to feed the world, but we are not necessarily applying both the logistics or necessarily the values in which we ensure that everyone has the capacity for sustainable and nourishing food. And so there are some things that we can do around that. And Billy's leading the way, for instance, around child hunger. Some of it has to do with food waste, as I'm sure Billy pointed out. Some of it has to do with, for instance, just access to markets. Some of it has to do with humanitarian crisis we see with, for instance, climate change, and also with conflict, areas of places. We know that there is no reason to be having famine in this world at this moment in history, and yet we are facing in places like Tigray and Ethiopia famine-like conditions. And so that is a matter of getting food to people where they need it, but it's also about supporting and ensuring that that farmers, who are often actually the poorest and those who are least well fed, have fair and equitable access to both profit from their products and again, access to markets. So, I mean, maybe just one quick example of the simplicity with which we can do really important things. We were just featuring a project that I had the chance to go visit in one of our global town halls from Egypt. It was a group, we worked with hundreds, actually thousands of women who are what we call fisher folk, who fish for a living, for their livelihoods to support their families. And they would go every morning before dark to a place where they would jeopardize their own health with wading into the water, literally, and catching fish, and then bringing it back to the marketplace, where they only had a few hours to sell it before it would go bad because of the heat. So with two simple things, simple kind of wetsuits that they were able to protect themselves from both the cold and the elements of the water. They were able to fish for longer and increase their yield. And then secondly, with simple coolers, they were able to sell for all day. So they could sell more and for longer. And so that was multiplying their incomes, by tripling and quadrupling their incomes on a productive level. So it does take, I think it's both innovation and creativity, but mainly I think a concerted effort to ensure that we create more equitable access and support for especially those people who are within the food sector, but who are often the last to eat and are having the poorest capacity from a nutritional value perspective.
So piggybacking on the logistics narrative, right? Access to food, some of this opportunity. Today, the biggest challenge is vaccine distribution. You talked a little bit about that. We're not all going to be safe until we're all vaccinated. Talk a little bit about, we feel good here in the United States. Some in the office, colleagues are, we're, shaking hands again. We're in the elevator again. What is it like outside of the United States? Where do we need to make improvements, and how do we increase and expand the access to vaccines? And how is this being done? And where could it have been done better, maybe, in terms of coordination or focus?
Yeah, well, there's so much there. If you think about where we were, for instance, in the early months of COVID, for instance, in New York, that is where many countries where care works are, that is where they are right now. So we've all seen the headline of what's happening in India. But you also can take that to places like Nepal and Bangladesh and Pakistan, and where health infrastructures are perhaps weaker than in the United States, where people are literally dying for lack of access or for oxygen and hospital beds. So one is in a place like India, even with there being one of the places around the world that is producing vaccines and is in the supply chain of vaccines, even at the end of this year, we don't anticipate that they'll have more than a third of their population vaccinated. In many of the places where care works, 1 to 3% of their population is currently vaccinated. So compare that to the United States, 50%, where we're starting to see the corner turn. So I think the real message here is we have to work together to ensure that the world has access, not only because it's the right thing to do from a humanitarian perspective to save lives, but also it's the right thing to do from an economic perspective. We did a study with Booz Allen Hamilton that looked at the calculation of how much, and it's in the estimated of trillions of dollars for the global economy, but hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's probably a low estimate, $700+ million that will cost the US economy if we don't address this at a global level, because we rely upon a global economy. And then I think the last thing I would say is we have seen in the US, for instance, there's two issues. One is supply of the vaccine, and the other is delivery of the vaccine. So we are failing on both counts in terms of the global supply, where so many countries don't have access to that. But we also have to think about, are these countries going to be ready when they have the supply to distribute it? So we're already seeing in places like the DRC where they are having to turn back vaccinations as a result of not having the capacity of moving it from, say, an airport tarmac to people around the country. Again, that takes a whole logistical set of focal points, and we need to ensure that we're supporting that. And I think we need to recognize, again, this is a humanitarian effort, but it's also our own safety and security is dependent upon this. When we look at the variants, when we look at the evolution of this disease, we have to ensure that we have a global set of solutions.
Yeah, and I find that Booz Allen study just so fascinating because it really just amplifies the economic impact globally on the United States, where we can't really be in a position where, like, at least we're vaccinated, we're fine. It's not the case anymore, right? You can't really ignore the variants and all these other dynamics that are going to directly impact us economically as well as physically and health-wise.
Right. And I think businesses know this. You look, I mean, the hospitality, the travel industry, there's a whole set of businesses that will not be able to get back without this really being addressed at a global level. And over time, I think we also have to recognize that this means that we have to invest in a global health infrastructure. As I talk to people who have worked in national security for decades, they say this is absolutely pointing us to the fact that our national security is dependent upon a stronger health infrastructure for the world, both in the recognition when we see pandemics that might start in terms of epidemics, but then also our ability to fight against them.
Yeah, no, I mean, we had Michelle Flournoy on a talk, and literally that was the topic, right? I mean, it wasn't the traditional kind of national security defense stuff. It was all about public health. And I mean, I know that she's very close to you and alike. So when you talk a little bit about getting vaccines out and then the mechanics of actually the distribution, such a large role is played by women, right? And you talked about the Fisher women and so on, just like the basic access of like the wetsuit and the cooler. Talk a little bit about the role of women in actually distributing vaccines and healthcare and the security they need and things that you may not think about when you just look at the numbers related to getting access out there. It's not as easy as it sounds, is it?
It's not. And when you think about it, the frontline community health workers are the ones that are going to be delivering these vaccines around the world. 80% of those are women. And often those community health workers are not even compensated. So, volunteer basically force. And so one of the real points of emphasis for CARE is how do we support those community frontline health workers? They're key to vaccine hesitancy. We all know that people get vaccines when they are hearing from and building upon a trust from those that are their doctors, that are their frontline health workers, that are their faith leaders. And so having those community frontline health workers be trained, having them be vaccinated themselves, by the way, so that they are protected as they go out and give vaccines into the world, and having them have equitable compensation. Again, those are all a part of building a healthy infrastructure, and women are at the center of that. We've certainly seen, you can see it in the responses at an anecdotal level, when we have women at leadership, we've had quite successful country capacity. When you have women, more seats around the table in the COVID task force, for instance, of countries, you have higher success rates. And when we are listening to and supporting and learning from our frontline health workers, who again are majority women, we are going to be much more effective.
Yeah. And not that you don't already have enough on your plate with global issues, expansion domestically on health and equity issues, but you've been talking a lot about civics and about a renewed focus on our democracy. And, 2020 was a challenging year, from the murder of George Floyd to the pandemic to the election to the insurrection. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing right now in terms of American leadership, threats to democracy, civics education. Like, oh, you it's in your family, right? You have public service is ingrained in you. How do you think about these things, and where do you think we're headed, and what are you worried about? What are you thinking about? I mean, obviously you're in Georgia now. Tell us a little bit about what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big concern for our democracy and our democracy in the United States, which I think we cannot be complacent about. And I think the last years have shown us how precious it is, but also how fragile it can be, and how important it is that we are all stewards of that democracy and lifting up our civic responsibilities. And that means, I think, being advocates. I think that means trying to ensure that we are expanding voter participation, not constraining voter participation, and also that we are creating a common set of facts. That is really important for a democracy. A functioning democracy is for a shared set of, if not, we can have different philosophies, we can have different approaches, but we do need a shared set of facts, especially as it relates to voting and integrity of our elections. And I think it's really dangerous when we don't have that. And in fact, I mean, I think one of the things that CARE has worked, again, around the world, and I'm talking to colleagues around the world who recognize how important it is for America to uphold these standards of democracy. And when America is actually perceived to be corrupting its democracy, or when it is perceived to be weak and fragile in its own democratic practices or the arts of democracy, it really does create a ripple impact around the world. And I think we are seeing that. And I think, we just have to understand that governance is central to development in any sense around the world, and that we certainly need to ensure that America stands strong in terms of our own democratic practice, and that in fact we can support good governance around the world, because it is key to defeating poverty, to gender equality, to a whole set of things that make a difference in terms of people's lives, saving lives, and ensuring a social justice around the world.
And look, we have the shared kind of experience at the Kennedy School, I believe. Talk a little bit about the soft power of CARE, right? Like, how important is it for an organization like CARE globally in terms of restoring the image of the United States and our kind of commitment globally to helping those most in need? I mean, over 75 years, really, it's kind of, epitomized what we stand for, right? I mean, where are you trying to take, CARE over the next 25 years? What's your plan for the future?
Yeah. Well,
because you don't have enough on your plate for the next 25 days. So,
exactly. We do need to think about the next 25 years as well. I mean, I think one way of thinking about the next 25 years is to think about the last 75 years. And if you think about the fact that actually this month, 75 years ago, the United States was delivering care packages to those who we had been fighting about a year, 12 months before. That's pretty extraordinary in terms of, I think, history. And I mean, one of my favorite things is to talk to some of those early care package recipients who say that their life was transformed when they received a care package and realized that their former enemy, who they had been told might be coming to kill them, was distributing chocolate to them, was distributing life-saving supplies to them. And many of them changed their own trajectory, became immigrants to the United States. And you think about now the role that Germany, care packages, then the Marshall Plan, the role that Germany plays in the world. There's now Care Germany that is spreading support and resources to countries around the world. You think about our most important trading partners. They were the former recipients of American aid. So I think we need to have a far-reaching, far-sighted perspective from an American leadership perspective, development and humanitarian. Hopefully CARE will be at the forefront of that. But my hope is in 25 years, we will really look back and think about the fact that we could defeat extreme poverty, but we know now that we can, and we saw it along the way, that there are real solutions, and with the right will and resourcing, and politics, we can get there, and that we can, for instance, achieve gender equality. So I'm very optimistic over the long term. I think we have to be, but I think that that implores us to ensure that we don't have an ounce of complacency to fight for these values that are so important to to both our present and to our future.
That's great. Last question, and then we'll let you go. But with this new focus domestically, how do you see CARE getting more involved on national issues, whether it's food policy, poverty issues? It seems like there was this opportunity or a need that warranted your, more direct attention and involvement domestically, which seems new based on the history. What's going to happen with that? Are you going to do more? Are you looking to get more active? How do you see CARE kind of playing in the ecosystem and fabric of advocacy that exists today?
Yeah. No, really important. I think that we will continue to look at how we can expand, for instance, some of our work around food security. We will also expand. We have CARE manages the largest micro savings program in the world. We have over 10 million people in 50 different countries that gather together on a weekly basis to save money together. We're going to apply and have started to pilot that program in the US. We know that, for instance, 40% of Americans' families can't afford a $400 emergency. So helping support savings capacity within families, and therefore financial stability and the ability to grow financial independence is going to be a part of our work. And ultimately our North Star is around defeating poverty, and we think that there need to be more scaled solutions and more public policy interventions to ensure that we can defeat poverty. And certainly we can do more than and see a greater progress than we've seen over the last 20 years in the United States. And I think some of the Biden administration policies promise that we can, for instance, really significantly reduce childhood poverty. I hope that CARE will be really focused in some significant measure around gendered poverty. We know that the majority of people living in poverty are women and children in the United States and around the world. And so I hope that we can be a big part of moving the needle in terms of the results for people living here in the United States.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be on, and to you and your team for all the work you're doing domestically, globally, and congrats on 75 years, and excited to see what the next kind of 75 have in store for you and your team. So just so grateful for you being on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to everybody tuning in, thanks for joining. Our next conversation is going to be next week on July 22nd with Michelle Schneider, who is the global head of workplace for Salesforce. We're going to hear how they're planning to get back to the office and thinking about the future of work. Until then, please get vaccinated if you haven't, and visit care.org to learn more and see how you can help. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thank you, Ken.
Stay well, everyone. Bye.